Okay, folks, I'm going to talk through the answers rather than write them down for you. So the brakes of a moving car are applied. Describe the effect of the braking force on the car. The braking force is going to slow the car down. So if it was travelling at a constant velocity before, you've now got an extra force acting against the direction of motion of the car. So if it was going from left to right, say, you've now got an extra force going from right to left. So the car is going to slow down. When a car brakes, the road exerts a force on each tyre to slow the car down. Describe the force that each tyre exerts on the road. So I think that's a slightly poorly worded question, but it helps to think about it. The road's exerting a force on each tyre all the time. You know this because you can get a car or a bicycle or anything else to slow down to a complete stop even without putting on the brakes. So if you were on a nice flat straight bit of road in a car or on a bike or whatever, and you were going at a constant velocity, either pedaling at a constant rate or having your foot on the accelerator by the same amount so that you're just going at a constant rate, if you stop pedaling or take your foot off the accelerator, you'll eventually come to a stop because of the friction between the tyres and the road. That friction's always there. It doesn't suddenly appear when you slam your brakes on. What's different, what's happening in question 1b, is that when the car brakes, you've then got this extra force from the brakes on the tyres, on the wheels, not really on the tyres, on the internals of the wheel. So your force that's, say, taking the car from left to right from the engine is then less than the force from the brakes plus the force between the friction between the tyres and the road because of friction. So overall, you've got a bigger force pushing against the motion of the car, so it slows down. A hammer hits a nail with a downward force of 50 newtons. What is the size and direction of the force of the nail on the hammer? So if the hammer is hitting the nail with 50 newtons, the nail is also going to hit the hammer with 50 newtons. The hammer's hitting the nail downward, so the nail hits the hammer upward with 50 newtons. Lorry tows a broken down car. The force of the lorry on the tow rope is 200 newtons. How much force is exerted on the tow rope by the lorry? Again, it's just the exact same thing, but with everything turned around. So if you say the force of the lorry on the tow rope is 200 newtons, you can say the force of the tow rope on the lorry is 200 newtons. You're just basically swapping the words around. Book is at rest on the table. Compare the force of the book on the table with each of the following forces. Force of the table on the book, that's going to be the same. So force of the book on the table is downwards, and that is equal to the force of the table on the book, and that's upwards. Force of the table on the floor. So the force of the table on the floor is going to be equal to just the weight of the table. I suppose you could, if you were being very thorough, you could say it's also the weight of the book. So you've got the book pushing down on the table, and then the table pushing down on the floor. When a student is standing at rest on the bathroom scales, the scales read 500 newtons. What is the size and direction of the force of the student on the scales? That's written in the question. All that's missing is the direction, but that's going to be downwards or towards the centre of the earth. So the student is standing at rest on the bathroom scales. The scales read 500 newtons. So there is a force of 500 newtons downwards from the student onto the scales. Size and direction of the force of the scales on the student, exactly the same in the opposite direction. So the scales are pushing up with an equal and opposite force of 500 newtons. Size and direction of the force of the floor on the scales. So if you are standing on some scales, pushing the scales downwards with 500 newtons, before you got onto the scales, those scales were still sitting on the floor, so they were pushing into the floor as well, and the floor was pushing back against them. So just like the book on the table. Yeah. So you could have a book on a table, scales on the floor. The book is pushing down on the table's pushing back up on the book, the scales are pushing down on the floor is pushing back up on the scales. Now when you get onto the scales, you're pushing down onto the scales with 500 newtons, so they're then pushing down even harder onto the floor. It doesn't tell us the weight or the mass or anything about the scales, but they're not going to be heavy. They're certainly not going to weigh as much as a person. So, even if we just say that they're, I don't know, 5 newtons, is that 500 grams? I don't know, maybe a bit more than that. 10 newtons, call them a kilogram. So your weight, 500 newtons, plus the weight of the scales, call it 10 newtons, is what's pushing down through those scales. So the force of the floor on the scales has got to be the same as that, unless you somehow manage to smash through the floor. Nothing's going anywhere, so your weight plus the weight of the scales is what's pushing down the floor. So the floor must be pushing back upwards with the exact same force.